Chapter 3, The Stink of Poverty, covering the years 1916 to 1917. School expanded Billy's perception in many ways. He learned of a world beyond the green hills of Indiana and Kentucky, a world at war. He heard names of countries he had never known existed: Germany, Austria, Hungary, and he learned how these countries had formed an alliance against France, Great Britain, and Russia. Although in the fall of 1916 the United States of America still remained neutral, Mrs. Temple kept her students informed on foreign affairs. She would often bring a newspaper to school to read the children articles about the war. Billy's imagination stirred with accounts of foot soldiers and commanding generals, fierce battles and romantic heroes. Sometimes he would spend half his lunch hour studying pictures of soldiers that were printed in the newspaper. Occasionally he would even see soldiers in downtown Jeffersonville. Their neat military uniforms fired Billy's 7-year-old imagination, making him long to be a soldier too. Lloyd Ford, a school chum of Billy's, had earned a scout uniform by selling the Pathfinder magazine during the summer months. Lloyd often wore it to school, much to Billy's envy. With its insignia patch on the front, its ranking stripes on the sleeve, its military-style hat, and its single stripe down the outside of each pant leg, Lloyd Ford's scout uniform looked like everything Billy wanted in a suit of clothes. If he could ever wear such a uniform, he knew he would feel so important. One day Billy got up enough nerve to ask Lloyd, "When you wear that uniform out, will you give it to me?" Lloyd said, "Sure, Billy, I'll give it to you." Toward the end of October, the weather turned cold. Frost carpeted the fields each morning and rarely melted off before 10 o'clock. Billy, still with no shirt, shivered as he ran along the Utica Pike. If he got to school early enough, he could warm his goosebumps by the cast-iron coal stove before classes began, and he had to take his assigned seat. Mrs. Wathan, the wife of Charles Boss, must have seen him running to school with a bare chest, because early one day she gave him a used coat with an eagle patch on the arm. Loving the luxury of so much warmth, Billy wore that coat every minute he worked or played outside his cabin. In school, he would keep his coat pinned up to the collar so that none of the other children would see he didn't have a shirt on underneath. Sleeping in the loft at night, Billy and his younger brothers could see stars peeking through the clapboard shingles. When it started to snow, Ella covered her boys with a canvas tarp to keep them dry while they slept. In the morning, that tarp was dusted with snow. Ella had breakfast ready before the boys woke up: hot biscuits and sorghum molasses. One morning she went to the sapling ladder and called, "Billy, you and Edward come down for breakfast." Billy answered, "Mama, I can't see. My eyes have got something in them." The chilly breeze circulating through the loft all night had caused his eyelids to stick shut. Ella said, "You got matter in your eyes. Just a minute, I'll fetch the coon grease." Whenever Charles shot a raccoon, he would cut the fat off the meat, and Ella would boil it down into lard, storing it in a can. Coon grease was the family cure-all. Ella would give it to her children for a bad cold with turpentine on it and coal oil. They would swallow it for a sore throat. Now Ella massaged warm coon grease into the boys' eyelids until they could open their eyes. Billy and Edward walked to school in the snow, sometimes following a wagon track, sometimes busting through drifts. They arrived at school soaking wet up to their knees. Fortunately, their wet shoes and pants dried out by lunchtime. They always carried their lunch together in a half-gallon molasses bucket. Inside the bucket, their mother packed a little jar full of greens, another full of beans, 2 pieces of cornbread left over from breakfast, and 2 spoons. Billy could smell the oven-baked bread in the other children's lunches. It smelled so good. He knew now that those children ate sandwiches and cookies for lunch, and he was ashamed to let them see his lowly beans and cornbread. So he and Edward walked down by the river, sat on a log, and set the jars between them to eat their lunch in private. Billy scooped a spoonful of beans first, then Edward poked in his spoon. Then Billy again, taking turns, careful that both jars emptied evenly between them. Near Christmas of 1916, Mrs. Temple had her students cut stripes of red, white, and blue paper and paste them into chains to take home and hang around their Christmas trees. Charles had never had a Christmas tree in the cabin before, But when Ella saw her son's decorations, she was determined that this year would be different. Taking an axe into the woods, Ella brought home a bushy little cedar. She draped the 2 paper chains over the boughs, but the tree still looked too bare. Charles had grown some popcorn in the garden that summer, and Ella thought this an ideal time to use it. She popped it in a covered kettle shaken over an open fire. With needle and thread she strung the popcorn into a long chain, then wrapped the chain around the cedar several times until she was satisfied it looked like a proper Christmas tree. After decorating the tree, Ella had some popcorn left over, so she put it in a half-gallon molasses bucket and sent it to school with Billy and Edward for a lunchtime treat. The 2 boys set their lunch bucket in the cloakroom, on a shelf above where the other children hung their coats. Billy still wore his coat all day, even in the classroom. About 10 o'clock in the morning, Billy's mind wandered to that popcorn. How would it taste, he thought. I wonder if I could try a handful before lunch. So he raised his hand and asked Mrs. Temple if he could be excused to use the outhouse. She said yes. As Billy passed through the cloakroom, he took the lid off the bucket, scooped out a big handful of popcorn, and put the lid back in place. He went outside behind the brick chimney and ate that popcorn, piece by scrumptious piece. Carefully he wiped his hands and face before going back inside so there would be no evidence to give away his cheating. At lunchtime, Billy and Edward went down by the river to eat on their log. They both wanted to munch the popcorn first. When they opened up the bucket, they could see that a third of the popcorn was gone. Edward looked up at Billy with innocent astonishment and said, "Say, something has happened to that popcorn." Billy tried to look as astonished as his brother. "Yeah, it sure has." Edward never suspected the truth. The boys hung up their stockings on Christmas Eve. The next morning each found an orange and 3 pieces of candy in his sock. Billy thought, "Oh, what a great fellow Santa Claus is to come and bring me that." He ate his orange Christmas Day, but the peelings he dried and carried with him in his coat pocket for weeks, sucking them like candy. Sometime in January of 1917, Billy noticed that Lloyd Ford had not worn his scout uniform to school since the Christmas break. He asked, "Lloyd, what about that scout suit?" Lloyd said, "I'm sorry, Billy, I forgot that you wanted it. I'll ask my mother." The next day Lloyd brought disappointing news. "Mother took the coat and made a dog pallet out of it, Billy. She used the trousers to patch Dad's pants. I haven't got a thing left but one legging." Undaunted, Billy said, "Then bring me that legging." Now Billy was the proud owner of one legging from a worn-out scout uniform with a stripe down one side and a drawstring on one end. He wanted so much to wear that legging to school, but he could not think of a way to do it. So he slipped the legging into his coat pocket where it would be ready when a good excuse came along. He did not have long to wait. A huge winter storm dumped its white fury all over the Indiana countryside. Some drifts measured 17 feet deep. Next it sleeted, leaving a glaze of ice on top of trees and snow, making perfect sledding conditions. The students at Utica Pike School now spent their lunch recesses sledding down a large hill close by. All the children had store-bought sleds. All, that is, except Billy and Edward. Billy remembered an old metal dishpan in a dump down by the river. He fetched it, and soon he and Edward joined the rest of the children at the top of the hill. They climbed in the dishpan, Billy in back, wrapping his legs around Edward in the front, and down the hill they scooted, spinning around as they slid. It was great fun, but eventually the rusty bottom wore out of the pan, and they had to find something else to use as a sled. This time they transformed a log, chopping on it until the front vaguely resembled a sled runner. The snow conditions were just icy enough so that it worked. The 2 boys rode their makeshift sled to great speeds on the steepest slope of the hill. On one particular sled run, the boys took a nasty spill at the bottom of the hill. Billy got up with snow crammed down his coat and a dull ache in his leg. Other children gathered around asking if he was all right. "Oh, I hurt my leg," he groaned. Then suddenly he got an idea. "That reminds me, I've got one of the leggings from my scout uniform in my pocket. That will make a good bandage." Taking the legging from his pocket, he pulled it over his tennis shoe and up around his aching leg, securing it in place with the drawstring. Just then the school bell rang, calling them back to class. That afternoon Mrs. Temple asked Billy to come to the blackboard. He stood sideways working his problem, hoping the other students couldn't tell he had a uniform on just one leg. But of course everyone noticed. Suppressed giggles soon turned into uproarious laughter. Billy started crying, and Mrs. Temple made him go home early. In April, Mrs. Temple brought a Louisville newspaper to school with a headline that screamed, "United States declares war on Germany." She read the article out loud, explaining how on March 18, 1917, German submarines sank 3 U.S. merchant ships, forcing President Woodrow Wilson to end America's neutrality. The United States of America had entered the war. Outside the schoolhouse, oak trees were budding. The days grew increasingly warmer. In the afternoon, Billy sat sweltering in his heavy winter coat, his toes now stuck up through the holes in the ends of his tennis shoes. One day Mrs. Temple noticed the students sitting in the back of the classroom making funny faces and holding their noses as if something stunk. She wondered if it had something to do with young William Branham. Why did that boy insist on wearing his coat on such a hot afternoon? She said, "William, why don't you take that coat off? Aren't you warm?" Billy's heart seemed to stop. He couldn't take off his coat. He didn't have on any shirt. "No, ma'am, I'm just a little bit chilly." She was surprised. "You're chilly on a day like this?" "Yes, ma'am." She said, "You better come over here and sit by the fire." Billy had kept his secret all winter long, and he wasn't about to let it out now. Reluctantly, he moved his seat next to the pot-bellied stove while Mrs. Temple threw in another shovelful of coal. Perspiration beaded his forehead, then trickled down his face. Mrs. Temple asked, "William, are you still chilly?" "Yes, ma'am." She shook her head. "You must be sick. You'd better go home." Billy stayed home for several days, wondering how he could get a shirt so he could go back to school. His aunt, his father's sister, lived across the hill from their cabin. She had a daughter about Billy's age. They had recently been over to visit, and his young cousin had left behind a dress. Even though it had decorative rickrack across the front and back, Billy decided he could get a shirt out of that dress. He cut most of the skirt part off and stuffed the rest down his trousers. Then he checked himself in the broken mirror nailed to the apple tree out back. He shook his head and crossed his fingers. When the school children saw the rickrack across his chest, they teased, "That's a girl's dress." "No, it's not," Billy insisted. "This is my Indian suit." They laughed even harder at such a notion and teased him mercilessly. "Billy Branham is wearing a girl's dress. What a sissy!" In spite of their ridicule, Billy wore that shirt every day until school let out for summer. He had to. It was the only shirt he owned.